Chapter 21. Djeduu. This world is dead. Our homes destroyed. But that doesn't mean we can't make a new home among the stars. Circa 25 days, 13 hours since the assassination of rebel leadership. As Uchantu waited with Arena, crouched in the shadow of one of the towering stacks of shipping containers, she had never been more grateful for their mundane, short-range comms. It made her feel just that much better as her teammates checked in periodically. Made her feel less exposed and alone in the middle of an Amaya military installation. The casualties from Memphoso had brought them down to 16 from their original 24. Uchantu had divided them up into 4 teams under herself, Naruna, Yaren, and Luhuta. Luhuta's team were their air support, as usual, and while Yaren's team planted explosives at strategic locations, Naruna and her team worked to disable the anti-air batteries in ships they would destroy, and prime those they would steal. Uchantu and her people would keep watch and be ready to support the others when needed. Despite Uchantu's fear of flying, she'd made everyone practice as well as they could the past few days. Thankfully, all strike team members went through basic pilot training, just in case, and had stressed Adendo's escape plan. The transports were for supplies, and wounded if necessary. Everyone else would steal a vehicle and leave on that. This raid needed to make up for their failure at Memphoso and leave them with enough supplies to be able to stay underground for weeks, maybe even months. She hoped the transport's modifications were everything Naruna had said they would be.
Uchantu,
Yaren's voice crackled in her ear.
We're ready whenever you give the signal.
She nodded, scanning her surroundings. There was no one in sight. The sun's light was a constant on Lightside, but people still needed to sleep. Uchantu had chosen a time between watch shifts, where those up during the first half of the day would be going to get some rest, and those who had just woken up would be taking their places. Both would be tired and less likely to be as thorough in their duties just yet. What Uchantu had told that lieutenant back at Memphoso had been true. Despite the Amaya's famed efficiency, its people were still just people. "Stand by," she whispered, then changed the channel. "Naruna, how much longer?" Silence for a moment.
5 ships and 3 more batteries,
Naruna said.
About 5 minutes, max.
Uchantu nodded. Everything was going right on schedule. Luhuta and her team would be waiting nearby, ready to drop in when she called for them. Wetting her lips, Uchantu broadened her signal to reach the entire team. "We're almost ready. Stick to the plan, and remember, this time, we don't hold back." Her stomach twisted at that, but it needed to be done. "We can't leave anything to chance, and we're not trying to win sympathy anymore. Don't go looking for a fight, but don't run if one comes to you." After a round of hushed affirmatives, Luhuta switched over to Luhuta. "Are we still clear?"
No signs of unusual activity,
Luhuta confirmed.
Just a sleepy port. We're...
"You!" Uchantu tensed at the shout, eyes wide as she turned toward it. 2 guards had spotted them and were running toward her and Arena, hands on their holsters. "Vitu." "Naruna, how much longer?"
2.5 minutes.
Too long. Gritting her teeth, Uchantu drew her firearm even as she switched to Yaren's channel. Arena drew with her. "Yaren?"
Yes?
Uchantu took a deep breath as the guards stopped, drawing their own weapons. "Detonate." Uchantu fired, center mass. Her sidearms report split the air, gaining a metallic quality as it echoed off the towering walls of stacked containers. The other guard dropped a moment later. The discharge from Arena's weapon pierced the air. Then the ground rumbled. A loud crack reverberated through the port, and Uchantu shivered as stacks of containers shook with the force of the explosion. Shouts rang out as 5 more explosions cracked the air, clouds of dark smoke billowing into the red sky. "Luhuta, you see that?"
Affirmative, Uchantu. We're on our way.
Yaren, make sure none of the batteries are usable. Remember, we need to get out of here with at least one fighter intact.
Got it.
Naruna, take those ships and get out of here.
I'm staying, Uchantu.
Uchantu blinked. What?
You might still need me. I told my team to go, but I'm staying. I'm going to disable these last 2 fighters. After that, I leave when you leave.
Despite her annoyance at Naruna's defiance, Uchantu was proud of the resolve in the woman's voice. Fine. Just get to me and Arena as soon as you can.
Uchantu,
Axeli shouted over the radio.
Imaya soldiers incoming. We heard the explosions. Do we engage?
Yes, you're with me, toward the docks where all the freight vehicles are. She turned to Arena. I'm going to distract them. You go help Yarn, then Naruna. We can still make this work, just on an accelerated schedule. Arena nodded, then ran off toward Yaren. Uchantu looked after her, then took off to meet Axeli and Chanook. Imaya soldiers and guards nearly caught her twice on the way there. Uchantu hated using her sidearm, but she'd trained for precision with all sorts of firearms. Between that and her hardlight, dropping those who attacked her barely took any effort, though it left her feeling cold. Just as Uchantu came in sight of the docks, massive Imaya barges docked there to ship resources back and forth across the ocean. Another explosion split the air. Uchantu couldn't help but grin as she tracked the column of smoke. That one came from near the dockmaster's offices. Stealing records and destroying their digital backups should set the Imaya back a few steps. Uchantu turned her attention back toward her surroundings and brightened her gem crest even as she raised her firearm. 3 guards had come into range, rifles leveled. She picked them off as they unloaded bursts of round toward her, cracking and straining her hardlight, then ran over and picked up one of the rifles and spare magazines before closing in on the docks. Axeli and Chanook were already there, under fire from Imaya soldiers and guards at various places. That was what she'd intended, but they needed help. She didn't want her distraction to end in any of her people dead. Bursting into a sprint, Uchantu slung the rifle over her shoulder and brightened her gem crest, forming her tonfas. She came up behind a batch of soldiers and struck them from behind. Her training allowed her to take out all 6 before they could react, leaving them limp or moaning on the ground. That encounter had slowed her, however, and she cried out as Chanook stumbled back into Axeli just as she came within range. Pushing herself to her limit, Uchantu sprinted even faster, then leapt toward her companions, throwing a hardlight barrier around them as she landed next to Chanook and crouched over him. I'm fine, he breathed, wincing as he tried to sit up, clutching his left arm. Through and through, just need to patch it up. Nodding, holding in a smile at seeing Chanook alive, Uchantu fished a roll of bandages out of one of the pouches at her waist and wrapped the wound tight, straining with the effort of tending to Chanook while keeping her barrier from shattering under the rain of bullets. Once she was done, she rose and looked to Axeli. He held an Imaya rifle and cocked his head at Uchantu, mask covering what was likely a bewildered expression. Why in darkness did you want to meet us here? He asked. We're the bait. How long do you think we can hold out if I drop the barriers? Axeli's antlered head swiveled as he looked around. I think we'd be cut to pieces. What if we had a distraction? I thought you said we were the distraction. A keening reached Uchantu's ears, one that grew louder by the second. We are, she said, smiling, for that. Uchantu pointed to the blood-red sky and beamed as 3 transports came into view, an old Imaya fighter at their head. Down, Uchantu shouted, pulling Axeli to the ground with her as Edendo opened fire. Uchantu whooped as Imaya soldiers ducked and ran for cover, yet the fire from the old rotary guns drowned out her voice and even the sea. Clouds of dust, rubble, and sparks flew into the air as Edendo tore up the docks. Columns of smoke and bursts of flame followed as he strafed over the assembled Imaya aircraft Naruna had disabled. Edendo's attack ripped the planes apart, but he didn't stop there. His guns kept firing as he flew over a section of containers, and Uchantu's eyes bulged. The massive towers toppled. Containers fell from 50 meters up to crash into the towers next to them, shaking and toppling them, and on down the rows of containers. Imaya soldiers and dockworkers scrambled, and Uchantu dropped her barriers, yanking Axeli and Chanook up by their collars as she rose to her feet. Come on, let's get to the pickup zone. Uchantu and her companions ran through the chaos that had enveloped the docks as even more explosions went off. A glance told her it was the Imaya soldiers trying to use the anti-air guns. Naruna and Yarn had rigged those to explode if someone tried to fire them. She, Chanook, and Axeli stopped occasionally to take out Imaya soldiers that dared pay attention to them, shooting at them from behind hard-light barriers before moving on to the next target, closing in on one of the untouched groups of containers, these not stacked as high. As they ran, the keening grew deafening once more, and Uchantu glanced up as Edendo's fighter soared low overhead. This time, it fired on the yard of forklifts and cranes, then moved on to the smaller military watercraft. Uchantu glanced at his path a few times as he looped back around. By that time, Uchantu, Axeli, and Chanook had made it to the transports, as had Arena and Yarn's teams. Axeli, get in there, she ordered. Help with getting the supplies in order. Muzuri, make sure he's all right.
Yes, sir.
The roar of engines made Uchantu whip around, and she looked to Edendo's fighter. It was still far off. Then she looked to the airfield and laughed as 3 shining, modern Imaya fighters, all in different shapes, soared off into the air. Whooping, Uchantu radioed Veranda. You gonna be able to fly those things?
Looks easy enough,
Veranda said.
Landing will probably be the hardest part. You want us to stick around? Cause a little more mayhem like Edendo?
No. Get back to Wolfden. Radio if you see any reinforcements and make sure you're too fast to follow. Let them know you're coming once you're in range.
Got it, sir. See you back at the base.
Uchantu smiled. It was working. As Yaren and Arena helped move the anti-air battery they'd recovered into the hold of Luhuta's transport, and everyone else moved the supplies and records they'd stolen from the buildings into the other 2, Uchantu scanned the area for soldiers and found a few forming up, rounding a toppled mountain of containers. She brightened her gem crest and raised her rifle, letting out a sharp whistle for her team to fall in behind her, when color from above caught her attention. She looked up to see Edendo's fighter losing altitude, one wing smoking.
Edendo!
Yarn cried. Uchantu watched, horrified, as the plane careened toward one of the massive barges. She barely remembered to throw up a hard-light barrier between her people and the approaching soldiers. At the last moment, just before the plane sailed over the water and into the ship, something flew out of the top of the fighter. Moments later, a parachute popped open above it as the plane exploded, rocking the Amaya ship and setting it aflame. You crazy idiot, Uchantu breathed into her radio.
I've got a plan,
Edendo shouted over the radio.
Just secure the containers.
Uchantu started in that direction, then tensed, realizing the Amaya soldiers hadn't fired on her. They were looking at Edendo. Dropping her barrier, Uchantu sprinted toward him. Arena, Yaren, with me. The rest of you, get the containers out of here. Yaren and Arena unloaded their stolen rifles at the Amaya soldiers, dropping most and scattering the rest. Uchantu didn't stop, though. She conjured a hard-light barrier behind her just to be safe and ran toward the Amaya soldiers. Even as they trained their rifles on her, Uchantu lunged for them, forming her tonfas over her arms. Though Uchantu hadn't been trained in it, she didn't fight in an acrobatic style. She was a brawler. That training, however, meant she knew how to move quickly and how to put as much power behind her strikes as possible. And once, Karuxi had told her that she knew how to use hardlight even more intuitively than his father had. Uchantu tore through the Amaya soldiers. Bones cracked and joints snapped under her assault. Each sound sickened her, but she didn't have a choice. She had a mission to complete. At some point, one of the soldiers got a lucky strike in, and Uchantu stumbled back as her cheek lit up with pain. She threw up a hardlight shield before her, vaguely aware she was almost down to 2/3 capacity. More Imaya soldiers closed in on her, but gunfire erupted behind Uchantu, and several of them dropped, the others falling back or ducking behind cover. Shaking herself, Uchantu drew her sidearm and fell back, firing when those behind cover poked their heads out. She'd taken out 2 by the time Yarn stepped up beside her. They've almost got the containers, he shouted between bursts. Let's fall back. Uchantu nodded, then caught something out of the corner of her eye. She grabbed Yarn's arm and whirled, yanking him after her as she threw up a hardlight barrier just as one of the gun placements opened fire. The effort of keeping the shield whole as she and Yarn ran was like a punch to the gut every time one of the rounds hit the hardlight. I thought you took care of those, she shouted. We must have missed one. Obviously. Uchantu continued to run toward the transports, but didn't see the point. That battery would tear them all to shreds, ships included. Just protecting her and Yarn for this long had nearly brought her Aurora Light down to half capacity. The barrage stopped. Uchantu nearly stumbled and let her barrier fall in shock. Yarn caught her, but they came to a stop, and Uchantu whipped around toward the gun placement, tense. It was turning. Ice formed in Uchantu's stomach. It's going for the transports. They won't make it. It was turning in the wrong direction. Uchantu followed the weapon's line of sight as it rotated on its stand, then looked toward the airfield where Amaya soldiers rushed toward the untouched aircraft. What? The massive gun opened fire. Uchantu shrank her hardlight shield, watching in awe as the gun tore through a few of the fighters Edendo had missed, sending the Amaya soldiers running. Who's manning that gun? Uchantu breathed, opening her radio to the whole team.
Sorry I didn't get to it sooner,
Naruna said.
I wanted to wait until the soldier was too focused to notice me.
Grinning, Uchantu shook her head and looked back toward the transports. They were done loading the supplies and getting Chinook strapped in. The transports had their doors closed and were rising into the air, facing the untouched containers Uchantu's team had come for. Arena, Uchantu barked over the radio. Get to Naruna for support. We might need her in a minute, and I want someone on that gun.
On it.
The rest of you split up. I want half on the transports. The other half of you get to those fighters and get out of here. Do a pass around the port just in case transports need support. But if you don't see anything, get back to base. Uchantu looked to Yarn, saw the tightness in his jaw and the worry in his eyes. Edendo, where are you?
About to be soaking wet. You look in the harbor yet?
Uchantu glanced toward the docks, but mountains of containers blocked her view. No. Why?
Are you kidding? Ugh. Just make sure you look on your way out of here. Let's just say the Amaya have two much bigger problems to worry about right now.
Uchantu exchanged a puzzled look with Yarn, who shrugged, shaking his head, then took a deep breath. Just get to a fighter and get out of here.
Yes, ma'am.
What about us? Yarn asked as half their team sprinted past him toward the airfield, rifles in hand. Uchantu looked toward the fighters, just to make sure she didn't need to shield her people, then back to the transports. We're going to steal some fighters of our own. She grinned as one of the transports, hovering above 2 stacks of 3 containers each, deployed 2 sets of jointed hooks from the bottom. Her people rushed to slide the flat ends under the containers, then activated the emerald geororals. Uchantu, left! Uchantu shielded them without looking. She winced as bullets pelted the hardlight, but kept her eyes fixed on the transports. This is it. She really hoped Naruna had known what she was doing. The transport lifted higher, hooks going taut beneath it. They strained for a moment. Then the containers lifted off the ground. Ha! Uchantu cried as they kept rising, held together as though they were a single piece rather than 6 separate containers. It worked, Yarn breathed. Uchantu had no idea how their informant had arranged to get those specific containers stacked that way, but if she ever saw him, she would kiss him for it. As the other 2 transports moved into place, Uchantu turned back toward the soldiers that advanced on them. She was getting low on Aurora Light, below half now, but that should be enough. Cover me, she told Yarn, then sprinted toward the soldiers, pushing her hardlight ahead of her. This was a much less elegant way of fighting than she'd been taught by either Matsanga or Aitaparit, but it was just so freezing effective. Uchantu slammed her shield into the soldiers before her, throwing them back. She dismissed it immediately, taking the 4 on the right as Yarn took the 3 on the left. Leaving nothing to chance, Uchantu wielded a tonfa in one hand and her sidearm in the other. She broke jaws and ribs and ripped through armor and flesh. Putting down the soldiers with such brutality left her cold, but it needed to be done. They were so close, she couldn't let a dazed soldier regain his senses and surprise them at the last moment. She and Yarn stood alone again in less than a minute. Her heart hammered, and she looked to the airfield. Her people were climbing into their fighters. The air split with gunfire, and Uchantu looked toward the edge of the airfield just in time to see Naruna's gun stop 2 armored Imaya vehicles in their tracks as they sped toward Uchantu and her people.
Uchantu, we're done,
Luhuta called.
The containers are secure, and we're taking off.
Uchantu grinned, then activated her radio. Everyone get to the fighters and get out of here. I want 3 of you with the transports, but the rest of you fly straight to your designated bases. We've kicked the hornet's nest. Let's get out of here before all of them come out. Might be too late for that, Arena said, voice strained. We've got incoming, east of the airfield. Uchantu whirled in that direction, eyes wide as she took in the mass of Amaya vehicles headed their way. Half looked like troop transports. The others were armored and had weapons mounted on the top. Those could take out the fighters. Arena, open fire, she shouted, sprinting toward the oncoming threat. Yarn will take over. Once he does, get out of here. What will you do? Arena asked. Uchantu took a deep breath. Uchantu? Despite the ice in her stomach, the tightness in her throat, a calm resolve settled over Uchantu. The mission was more important than any one person making it out. Estingai needed the Remnant more than they needed her. Everyone did. I'm going to get you out of here. And she would break as many Amaya toys as she could in the process. Uchantu crouched as she passed a fallen Amaya soldier, plucking her rifle off the ground, then stopped, took a moment to aim, and fired at the closest gunman. 2 shots hit the shield, but a spray of red flew into the air with the third as the soldier whipped back. These weren't tanks, thankfully. The Amaya had little use for those now that there were no cities to siege. But they were faster, and it would be easier for another soldier to climb up to operate that gun than it would be with a tank. The other vehicles started to fire back, and Uchantu raised a hardlight shield, picking off the gunmen and firing into the canvas of a few of the transports. That made her taste bile, but it meant less soldiers for her people to deal with. And that was all she needed to worry about. Naruna and Arena helped a lot. The armored cars sparked as their plating resisted the bullets, but the heavy gun cut the troop transports to shreds. After it tore through 3 of them, the rest stopped, pulling in behind their defunct counterparts, and soldiers jumped out and started running for Uchantu in the airfield. I've got the gun now, Yarn said. Arena and Naruna are on their way. Go for the tires on the armored ones, Uchantu shouted, sprinting toward the vehicles again. Arena, Naruna, go straight for the aircraft. We don't have much time. But I'll be fine. Go. Uchantu hoped she wasn't lying. She probably was. It took only a few seconds after that for the first of the armored vehicles to come within range. Uchantu had taken out its gunner, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. With all that armor, it could probably run through the fighters if it needed to. Planting her feet, Uchantu took a deep breath, then brightened her gem crest. She formed a steep wedge about 4 feet high, just before the vehicle's front left tire, wincing as she held its shape and position against the inertia, then roared as she lifted it into the air. It was just a small bump, but she'd done it right as the tire reached the top of the ramp. The vehicle's speed worked against it, and it flipped over, unbalanced. Uchantu didn't give herself a moment to breathe before moving on to the next one. Even as she brightened her gem crest, the roar of the fighter engines filled the air. Her people were getting out of here safely. That was all that mattered. Flaring her gem crest, Uchantu shifted to more aggressive tactics. Flipping the first vehicle had made for a good show, but it had sapped too much of her dwindling aurora light. Instead, Uchantu focused on shields and spears. She ran in erratic snake-like patterns, using her hardlight to block enemy fire when she needed, but relying on her speed and the slow enemy guns to keep her safe. A few of them surprised her. She'd thought most would have standard high-caliber turrets. A few did, but one had a flamethrower, and she had to form a dome around her as bolts of lightning forked out from one. A cold flash bit away at her aurora light, and for a moment, Uchantu found herself preparing for the worst. The Amaya's own weapons worked against them, however. High-caliber rounds rained down on the vehicles. They couldn't touch the bodies or the engines, but shredded gunners and tires. Run, Uchantu! Uchantu didn't need to be told twice. She raced toward the airfield, trusting Yarn to protect her, though she had a thin barrier of hardlight trailing behind her. Relief swept over her as she saw Naruna and Arena getting into their fighters as 2 others took off. There were 3 left. 1 for her, Yarn, and Arena fell. No. Uchantu's heart pounded as she raced toward Arena. No, please. Naruna had noticed and reached Arena just as Uchantu slid down next to her friend, throwing a wall of hardlight up between them and the approaching soldiers. They were more focused on Yarn, but a few rounds cracked her shield, straining her reserves further. Arena was bleeding from her right shoulder. A lot. Gritting her teeth, Uchantu helped Naruna turn Arena over. Uchantu breathed a sigh of relief. Arena's face was sweaty and pale, eyes squeezed shut, but she was breathing. Uchantu looked down, pulling open the woman's jacket. There was no exit wound. Ice needled her stomach. Uchantu looked to Naruna and saw the same realization on her friend's face. This was bad. The transports were too far out, and they wouldn't be able to safely escape if they returned. No, I'm not leaving her here. Can you fit her on your lap? Uchantu asked. Naruna nodded. Help me get her up. Arena cried out as Uchantu and Naruna lifted her, carrying her toward the fighter. Hang on, Arena. Naruna started up the ladder, then looked to Uchantu. Get into the cockpit, Uchantu told her, brightening her gem crest. She was running low, but she would not leave Arena behind. Naruna nodded and scrambled up as Uchantu scooped and lifted Arena in a hard-light construct. She clenched her fists, breathing heavy with the effort of lifting Arena into the air, then trying to deposit her as gently as she could before dismissing her construct. Got her! Narena called just before the engine roared to life.
Get out of here!
Uchantu turned and ran toward the nearest fighter. Halfway there, she heard Naruna take to the air. Uchantu gritted her teeth as she came within just a few meters of her fighter. Once she was in the air, she could circle around and use the plane's weapons to tear down anything that got between Yarn and his fighter.
Uchantu, down!
Uchantu threw herself to the ground, covering herself with a shallow, hard-light dome. Lightning and high-caliber rounds ripped through the fighters, even as she hit the ground. 2 caught fire, and the other lost a wing. No! That was their way out. Uchantu scanned the airfield, frantic. But Edendo and Naruna had been thorough in their sweeps of the airfield. Yaren, what now? They were trapped. Uchantu wouldn't call back her people to try and rescue her. Not with those guns that could tear through aircraft so easily. Yaren, any ideas? We break shit. As much as we can. Maybe take one of the armored cars. Uchantu felt cold. And not in the way she had before. That was something, but they would be chased through the desert. And if the Amaya sent out speeders or more aircraft, they would find them. All right, Uchantu agreed. We
get to the bridge.
Uchantu blinked at Edendo's voice, looking around for the source, though it had crackled in her ear.
Edendo?
Yaren yelled over the shared channel. Gunfire cut through the air in the background.
Where are you?
Just get to the bridge,
Edendo ordered.
the one leading to a massive crane. Hurry.
Uchantu looked toward the anti-air gun Yarn had taken, then followed the raised platform over toward the sea. She saw it. The cars had passed under it, and soldiers huddled down among their damaged transports just below it. Yarn kept them at bay with wild sweeps. We'll do it. Yarn, keep up that suppressing fire until I get there.
Got it.
Limbs aching, Uchantu pushed herself up and ran for the stairs to Yarn's position. She'd always hated running and sprinting, especially when she had to do it in twisting tunnels that weren't anywhere near long as a track. But she'd never been more thankful that Estingai and Svemaku had forced the stupid routine onto her. Her heart would have likely exploded by now, if not for that. Or at the very least, her legs would have given out. Uchantu raised her hard light shield as some of the soldiers fired at her. She was dangerously low now, close to becoming lightless. She could fight without her hard light, but fighting lightless was something else entirely. Somehow, she made it to Yaren. She didn't stop as she reached him, just yelled to get his attention, then pulled him along as she passed. Edendo, we're almost there, Yarn yelled. Where are you?
Coming in hot,
Edendo yelled. The man almost sounded happy.
Hold on to the railing and duck.
Uchantu crouched, gripping the railing hard as she and Yarn rounded the corner onto the bridge. It left them terribly exposed, and she hoped the flooring was thick enough to resist the soldiers' rifles, at least. Edendo! Uchantu cried. Where? She cut off as a loud rumbling split the air, and a massive, shining Imaya fighter shaped like a trident swooped down from above and stopped at the last moment, hovering over the bridge.
Hop on,
Edendo said over the comm.
There's handholds and footholds on the wings for some reason. One for each of you.
Uchantu's stomach clenched at the idea of clinging to the wing of a fighter as it sped through the air. Her head felt light for a moment, but as Yarn pulled her toward the fighter, Uchantu forced those feelings down and steeled herself. Using the last of her aurora light, she threw up a barrier as soldiers began to fire from below, and the turrets on the armored vehicles turned around toward the fighter.
Make it quick!
Uchantu yanked herself up onto the wing, boosting herself with a push of hard light from below, then grabbed onto the grips and set her feet into little niches on the wing, crouching low. She released her hard light, minutes away from being lightless if she had to block any more gunfire.
Hold on!
Edendo's fighter lurched backward, just in time to avoid a barrage from the turrets, then angled up, causing Uchantu's stomach to lurch. Uchantu squeezed her eyes shut, and her hands turned to Titan steel, unyielding in their grip as Edendo sent the fighter climbing into the air. Yarn whooped over the comms, and Edendo joined in. Uchantu found herself joining in as well, as the fighter leveled out.
Where did you find this?
Yarn called, laughing.
Found a hangar near the water after I took out 2 of my barges,
Edendo said.
Had a few newer fighters inside. Sorry it took me a bit to decide which one to take.
You what? Uchantu said. Edendo laughed, then banked, angling the fighter.
Look over there.
Uchantu took a deep breath and forced her eyes open. They bulged. For a moment, even the sense of vertigo didn't bother her as she stared transfixed at the 2 smoking barges, each one partially submerged in the harbor's red waters, containers falling off into the sea. Imaya personnel swarmed around it like ants.
Told you they'd be busy for a while,
Edendo said. You're insane, Yarn breathed.
Isn't that why you love me?
Edendo laughed. Uchantu squeezed her eyes shut again to try and ward off the vertigo, and opened up her channel to the entire team. Anyone who was still in range, at least. Everyone, we made it out. Excited cheers and whoops crackled through the channel. Are any of the transports still close enough to hear me?
I am,
Lahuta answered.
Glad you made it out. You had us worried there for a second.
Uchantu smiled. I want you and Excelli with me. Everyone else, get back to your bases.
Where are we headed?
Edendo asked. Last Shadow. I have a feeling Estingai might need our help.